The document had been locked inside a Roman archive for 4 centuries, and when the sealed file was finally opened, the room did not erupt with discovery. It went silent. What lay on the table did not answer the question haunting the Church after Pope Leo XIV's election. It made the question darker, sharper, and far more dangerous. The name attached to the document was Malachy, and the year tied to its origin was 1139. For generations, the prophecy of the popes had stood at the edge of Catholic history like a locked door nobody could fully open. Skeptics called it a forgery shaped by politics. Believers saw in it a sequence too precise to dismiss. But after Pope Francis died and Leo XIV appeared, the old argument changed shape. Every known version of the prophecy seemed to end with Petrus Romanus, the final figure in the list. Yet Leo was now seated on the chair of St. Peter, and he did not fit the name, the symbol, or the expected ending. That alone was enough to unsettle historians, commentators, and bishops already watching his first year with suspicion. Then the archive produced something nobody had prepared for. After the final motto, after the place where the prophecy was supposed to stop, there were 8 more lines. They described another shepherd who carried no name from the list, a figure who would come after the last one named a man tested by fire, not of his making. The passage did not call him the final pope. It called him the test. On the morning of May 26, 2026, 6 people gathered inside the Palazzo della Congregazione Padrotrina della Ed to examine that passage. There was no public notice, no press briefing, and no entry on the Vatican calendar. Outside, Rome continued as if nothing had shifted. Inside, a medieval text had just placed Pope Leo XIV's hardest question on the table. It began as many moments of reckoning begin inside the Vatican, not with a public announcement, but with a silence that did not appear on any schedule. It was the morning of May 26, 2026. Pope Leo XIV had been in office for exactly 1 year, 17 days and a few hours. By then, his first year had already left marks across the Roman Curia that nobody inside the old system could ignore. He had restructured 2 major dicasteries, dismissed 4 senior curial officials without ceremony, and launched the first formal audit of Vatican financial operations in a decade. He had done it without theatrical speeches and without visible anger. The decisions arrived quietly one after another, with the calm precision of a man who had already accepted the cost before anyone else had understood the price. That calm made his opponents more nervous, not less. The world had watched the first American pope move faster than almost any observer expected. Inside Rome, resistance had begun to organize around him. Cardinals whispered in private apartments. Bishops in the American Midwest gave interviews that sounded careful but carried unmistakable warnings. And conservative Catholic media organizations spent months cataloging every appointment, every departure from tradition, every symbolic gesture that suggested Leo intended to govern rather than merely inherit. The pressure around the papacy was no longer theoretical. But the meeting on May 26th was not about the audit, the dismissals, or the reshaping of Vatican offices. It was not about American politics, episcopal resistance, or the growing media campaigns against the new pope. It was about a medieval Irish monk who had been dead for 878 years. His name still had the power to make educated people lower their voices. Deep inside the Palazzo della Congregazione Padrotrina della Ed, the building that houses the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith, a meeting had been arranged through channels that left almost no trace. There was no press briefing, no public calendar entry, no formal announcement, and no visible sign that anything unusual was happening inside the building. The corridor outside remained controlled, ordinary, and quiet. The door closed, and 6 people took their places around the table. 3 of them were Vatican historians. 1 was a senior archivist. 1 was a theologian whose expertise was medieval ecclesiastical manuscripts. The 6th person had been called in from outside the Vatican, a professor of church history at the Pontifical Gregorian University named Dr. Aurelio Fabri. He was 63 years old, and for most of his career, men like him were only noticed when something old had become dangerous again. Fabri had spent 35 years studying prophetic traditions within the Catholic Church. He was not a man of dramatic claims, public panic, or apocalyptic performance. His work was methodical, precise, heavily sourced and shaped by the discipline of archives rather than the appetite of headlines. He had published in peer-reviewed journals, testified before Vatican commissions, and built a reputation on caution. That caution was why the others listened when he said something did not make sense. For the previous 8 months, Fabri had been tracking a problem he could not explain cleanly. It had not begun with a revelation, a rumor, or a dramatic discovery in a sealed room. It had begun with a footnote. In October 2025, Fabri was reviewing a digitized catalog of manuscripts from the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris when he found the line that would change the next 8 months of his life. It was buried inside an obscure 17th century bibliographic index. the kind of reference most researchers passed over because it looked administrative, secondary, and dead. The index listed manuscripts once held by a Benedictine monastery in Lyon before the French Revolution. One footnote referred to a variant copy of the Lignum Vitae. That was the first problem. The Lignum Vitae, published in 1595 by Benedict and monk Arnold Wan, was not supposed to exist as a manuscript tradition with variant readings. It was a printed compilation famous because it had introduced the prophecy of the popes to the public world. Scholars knew copies of it, citations of it, arguments about it, and accusations against it. They did not know alternate versions with additional content. The footnote was not vague. It described a document with additions, posteriores, later additions that did not appear in Wyon's published text. Fabry read the phrase twice, then copied the reference into a separate file. Nothing about it proved that the document existed or that the cataloger had understood what he was describing, but the wording was too specific to ignore. For 3 months, Fabry followed the trace from Paris to a small archive in Lyon, then from Lyon into a chain of references that pointed toward Rome. The path passed through inventory numbers, old donation records, partial descriptions, and collection labels that had been rewritten more than once. Each step answered one question and opened another. By December, the trail led to a private collection donated to the Vatican Library in 1923. That donation had never been fully cataloged. Part of it had been absorbed into the ordinary structure of the library, while another part remained inside a sub-collection. Known only to a small circle of archivists and specialists, the material was not secret in the theatrical sense. It was worse than secret. It was forgotten by process, buried under incomplete paperwork, old labels, and the quiet inertia of an institution that had preserved too much history to know every object it possessed. Fabry found what he was looking for in January 2026. The document was not placed in a dramatic box marked with Malachy's name. It sat under a neutral description attached to a collection whose internal logic had not been reconstructed since its donation. The senior archivist who helped him gain access understood the risk only after the first inspection. Once Fabry saw the structure of the text, the old footnote from Paris no longer looked like a mistake. By May 26th, the original was no longer being handled casually. A high-resolution photographic reproduction had been prepared, and the 6 people in the room were staring at it under controlled light. 2 of the 3 historians had been told only that they were being asked to evaluate an unusual manuscript discovery. They had not been told the subject. When Dr. Chiara Valetti arrived, saw the images on the table, and understood what she was looking at, she asked one question before anyone else spoke. "Where has this been?" Nobody answered at once. The answer moved through Paris, Lyon, Rome, and an uncatalogued Vatican donation from 1923. It moved through a Benedictine monastery lost to the violence and seizures of the French Revolution. It moved through missing inventories and professional silence. By the time Fabry began explaining the chain, everyone in the room understood that provenance was no longer a background issue. It was the first battlefield. The object in the photographs was roughly 14 in x10, written by hand on vellum that had aged in ways no simple reproduction could imitate. Carbon dating and paleographic analysis placed it in the middle of the 12th century. The script matched known examples of Cistercian monastic writing from the period between 1140 and 1170. The vellum showed deterioration consistent with age and the ink. Composition matched materials available in northern France and Ireland during that period. None of that settled the matter. In Vatican historical work, consistency is not the same as proof. A document can look right, test right, and still require months of physical examination before anyone with authority dares to speak with certainty. The scholars around the table understood this immediately. The danger was not that the manuscript proved too much, but that it suggested too much before proof could catch up. The main body of the text was recognizable as the Prophecy of Saint Malachy, the Prophecy of Saint Malachy. It contained 112 cryptic Latin mottos, each traditionally linked to a successive bishop of Rome. The sequence began with Celestine II, elected in 1143, and ended with the final entry, most versions identified as Petrus Romanus. For centuries, that final name had carried the full weight of the controversy. But this version did not stop there. After the 112th motto after Petrus Romanus, there was a 13th block of text. It did not appear in Arnold Wyon's 1595 Lignum Vitae. It did not appear in the known manuscript traditions examined by scholars across 4 centuries. It was 8 lines long, written in Latin consistent with the period, and the hand appeared to match the rest of the document. Fabry did not rush the reading. He knew every word would matter if the passage ever left that room. He translated with the care of a man who understood that a single careless phrase could turn scholarship into ammunition. The others watched the page while he moved line by line through the text. The passage said that after the last shepherd named in the vision, another would come who bore no name from the list. It said he would carry the weight of the world's end of patience. It said he would be tried in fire, not of his making. It said his trial would determine whether the church survived its own age. When Fabre reached the final sentence, no one interrupted. The words were simple enough to be remembered without notes. He is not the last. He is the test. In that room, the sentence did not sound like poetry, and it did not sound like doctrine. It sounded like a problem. Dr. Valetti was the first to speak after the silence. She asked when the document had last been examined. Fabre answered that, as far as he could determine, it had never been examined since being sealed into the uncatalogued collection in 1923. That answer changed the temperature of the meeting because it meant the passage had not merely been overlooked in a catalogue. It had been waiting inside the system for more than a century. Nothing about the prophecy of Saint Malachy was simple, and everyone in that room knew it. The document on the table was not entering an empty field. It was entering one of the most stubborn controversies in Catholic intellectual history, a dispute built from medieval sanctity, Renaissance politics, papal succession, forged memory, and the strange human hunger to know whether history has already been written. Malach himself was real. His Irish name was Mael Maidach Wu Morgar, and he was born in Armagh in 1094. He became Archbishop of Armagh from 1132 to 1137, and was remembered as a reformer inside the Irish Church. He was not a marginal mystic from a forgotten edge of Europe. He belonged to the serious ecclesiastical world of the 12th century. His closest and most powerful ally was Bernard of Clairvaux, the most influential churchman of that age. Malachy died at Clairvaux in 1148. In Bernard's arms on the Feast of All Souls, Rome canonized him in 1190 under Pope Clement III, making him the first Irish saint to receive that honor from the Roman Church. Bernard later wrote his biography, and in that account, he described Malachy as a man marked by unusual spiritual gifts. One of those gifts was prophecy. Modern historians treat that claim carefully because medieval geography often gave prophetic power to saints as part of their sanctity. It was not necessarily meant as courtroom evidence. It belonged to a world where holiness, signs, dreams, warnings, visions, and authority moved together. But the prophecy attributed to Malachy was different because it did not remain safely inside devotional memory. It appeared publicly only in 1595, more than 4 centuries after Malachy's death. Arnold Wan, a Benedictine monk, included it in his encyclopedic work on the Benedictine order, the Lignum Vitae. Wyan claimed that Malachy had composed the list during a visit to Rome in 1139, presented it to Pope Innocent II, and that the manuscript then disappeared into the Vatican archives for centuries before being found and published. That claim was the doorway through which the argument entered history. The skeptics had always had strong evidence. The mottos assigned to Pope Saint before 1595 seemed unusually accurate, as if someone working near Wyan's own time had written backward from known papal history. The mottos after publication were far less precise and often required broad, strained interpretations. To skeptical historians, the prophecy looked less like a 12th century vision and more like a late 16th century political construction. Yet, clear as throat, the believers and the cautious agnostics had never fully disappeared. Some correspondences were difficult to brush aside. John Paul II had been linked to delabor, solace of the labor of the sun, because he was born during a solar eclipse on May 18, 1920, and buried during a solar eclipse on April 8, 2005. Benedict XVI was linked to Gloria Olive, the glory of the olive through the Benedictine order and its olive branch symbolism. Francis was identified by many interpreters as the final entry, Petrus Romanus. That was where the old argument should have ended. Francis had died. The sequence had apparently reached its final named figure, and the church should have moved beyond the prophecy's frame. But in May 2025, Robert Francis Post stepped onto the central floor of St. Peter's Basilica as Pope Leo XIV. The list had ended, and yet the papacy had not. That was the fact that reopened everything. Leo XIV was the problem the old prophecy had not prepared people to solve. If Francis was Petrus Romanus, then the sequence had reached its final figure, and the next conclave should have existed outside the map. Yet the conclave of May 2025 had elected a new bishop of Rome, and that bishop was not named Peter, was not Roman by birth, and carried no obvious symbol that could be forced naturally into the final motto. The prophecy had not collapsed quietly. It had produced a vacuum. One group of interpreters said the simplest answer was the only honest one. The prophecy had failed. The list had run out. The church had continued, and the mystery should have been retired with the death of Francis. That position had the cleanest logic, but it did not satisfy a world already trained to read every papal transition as a sign. For many people, an unanswered ending is not an ending. It is an opening. A second group insisted Leo XIV was still Petrus Romanus in some hidden or symbolic sense. They argued that the prophecy did not have to be strictly linear or that the final motto did not require an obvious name or birthplace connection. The theory gained attention because it preserved the drama of the sequence. It also required ignoring what was directly in front of them. Robert Francis Post was a man from Chicago shaped by Peru, formed in the Augustinian order, and not visibly tied to Rome in the way the final name suggested. A third interpretation emerged with more scholarly caution. In 2025, the German church historian Dr. Heinrich Huri published a paper in Archium, Histoire Pontificiae, proposing a different count. He argued that 3 figures traditionally listed as antipopes should be removed from the papal sequence, while 2 additional figures counted as legitimate popes, in some traditions, had been excluded from Malachy's original count. Under that recalculation, the list had not ended with Francis. His theory placed Leo XIV somewhere in the final section of the sequence rather than beyond it. 2 more popes would follow before the prophecy reached its terminus. It was a technical argument built from papal numbering, disputed legitimacy, and medieval cataloging habits. It did not solve the spiritual anxiety around Leo, but it gave historians another structure to examine. None of those interpretations accounted for the 8 lines on the table. The new passage did not call the figure Petrus Romanus. It did not identify him as the last pope. It described someone after the last shepherd named in the vision, someone whose name was absent from the list, someone tested by fire, not of his own making. That detail struck Fabry harder than any symbolic match. The passage changed the argument from succession to pressure. It suggested that the crisis was not the arrival of the final pope, but the arrival of a pope whose pontificate would expose whether the church could survive its own age. That was why the room did not treat the document as a curiosity. If the passage was authentic, or even if it only appeared authentic long enough to reach the public, Leo's enemies would not need proof. They would need only interpretation. The 6 people remained in the room for 4 hours. They did not treat the document as a relic, and they did not treat it as a revelation. They treated it as evidence. The photographs moved across the table while the historians examined the Latin. The archivist reconstructed the provenance, and the theologian tested the passage against known medieval ecclesiastical language. Every answer produced another limit. The handwriting appeared consistent, but the photographs could not prove whether the additional passage had been written at the same moment as the main text. The vellum in ink seemed right, but a section-by-section analysis required physical access and scientific testing that had not yet been authorized. The provenance chain was plausible but incomplete. Nothing collapsed, nothing closed. Dr. Alio Siorgi from the University of Bologna finally asked the question that had been circling the room since the first reading. He wanted to know whether anyone outside the group had seen the material. Fabry answered with the same controlled precision he had used all morning. 3 people had seen some part of it: the archivist, Fabry himself, and a paleographer at the University of Strasbourg who had confirmed the script dating the previous November. Signori pressed the point. He asked whether the paleographer knew the subject matter. Fabry said she had been given only the primary medieval Latin text, not the additional passage. She knew it was an ecclesiastical document. She did not know it touched the Malachy tradition. That answer gave the room its first practical advantage. Siorgi nodded slowly and said they still had time. Valetti asked what kind of time he meant. He answered without drama because the danger did not need drama. Time to understand what they were looking at before anyone else did. By the evening of May 26th, Fabry had returned to his office at the Pontifical Gregorian University. He carried a copy of the photographs on an encrypted drive that only he could access. He placed it on the desk and sat for a long time without turning on the lights. Outside the building, Rome moved into the evening. Inside the office, the question had changed. Fabry was not a man inclined toward the apocalypse. He believed in evidence, method, provenance, and disciplined doubt. He did not believe that a medieval Irish monk had looked across centuries and seen the face of Robert Francis Post, but he also understood that the most important question was no longer whether Malachy had predicted the future. The real question was who had written those 8 lines when they had been written and why they had remained unseen. If the document was genuinely from the mid-12th century, then the passage had not been added by someone in 1595 to manufacture credibility around Wyon's publication. It had been present from the beginning, or close enough to the beginning to matter. That possibility did not prove prophecy. It proved dangerous. Fabry opened his laptop and pulled up the file he had been building on Pope Leo XIV since the conclave of May 2025. Robert Francis Post had been born on September 14, 1955, in Chicago, Illinois. He was the son of Luigi Marius Post and Mildred Martinez, a man with dual American and Peruvian citizenship, an Augustinian friar formed by decades of service in Peru before his rise through the episcopate. From 2023 to 2025, he had served as prefect of the dicastery for bishops. He had been elected on the second day of the conclave, May 8, 2025, on the 4th ballot. His first year had been remarkable for its pace. The financial audit, the curial restructuring, the dismissals, and the quiet signal that the age of managing the church's problems had ended all pointed in one direction. Leo had not come to preserve the appearance of order. He had come to confront what order had been hiding. The external pressures had grown with equal force. The relationship with the United States government had become strained over immigration, international aid, and climate policy. Leo spoke carefully, but he did not soften Vatican positions to satisfy the political powers of his country of birth. Parts of the American political establishment responded with open hostility. The first American pope had become a problem for America. Inside the church, the divisions had sharpened instead of easing. Traditionalist networks in the United States, Poland, and Hungary appeared more coordinated than before. Bishops who had been restrained under Francis became louder under Leo. Certain Catholic media outlets moved from criticism toward denunciation, and every reform was framed as evidence that something older was being dismantled. Beyond the church, 2026 had opened under pressure. Economic instability, political fractures, international crises, and climate-related events in the Southern Hemisphere had pushed the Vatican into conflicts over power, money, borders, and human dignity. Fabri stared at the phrase from the traditional prophecy, many tribulations. Then he looked again at the new passage. It did not call the figure Peter the Roman. It called him another who bore no name from the list. Fabri closed the laptop. The words, "he is the test," had become harder to dismiss because they no longer depended on a perfect prophetic fit. They described a pontificate as a crucible, not a conclusion. Somewhere in Casa Santa Marta, Leo XIV was living in the residence he had refused to leave for the Apostolic Palace, a choice understood inside the Vatican as a signal of simplicity and proximity. Fabri decided that the Pope probably did not need to know about the document. Not yet. On May 27th, the situation changed before Fabri had finished convincing himself that silence was still possible. He arrived at his office at 7:40 in the morning and found a message from the archivist. It was brief, careful, and written without names. It made no explicit reference to Malachy, the photographs, or the 8-line passage, but Fabri understood it before he reached the final sentence. Someone else knew. He called the archivist from a phone he rarely used. The conversation lasted only a few minutes. Sometime within the previous 48 hours, the same uncatalogued collection had been accessed by a second researcher. The request had come through official channels properly filed with the Vatican Library Administration, and the name on the application meant nothing to Fabri at first. The institutional affiliation meant much more. The researcher was connected to a private foundation based in Munich with close ties to several prominent traditionalist Catholic organizations. Fabri sat very still as the archivist explained the access record. The foundation had not stumbled into the collection by accident. It had followed a trail. For the next 2 hours, Fabri worked the phone with the discipline of a man trying not to create panic while measuring how much time had already been lost. By 10 nights, he had spoken to 3 people whose judgment he trusted completely. By noon, the picture was clearer and worse. The Munich Foundation had been tracking the uncatalogued collection for at least 6 months. Their interest appeared to have begun with the same bibliographic footnote that had started Faber's own investigation, or possibly from information obtained through someone who had noticed his preliminary inquiries. The Foundation's representative in Rome had filed the access request 4 days earlier. He had entered the archive the day before. What remained unknown was whether he had found the document, and if he had found it, whether he had understood what the final 8 lines meant. What was known was enough. The Foundation's published work carried a clear argument. The current papacy represented a catastrophic departure from authentic Catholic tradition. Its writers had already framed Leo's reforms as rupture, not renewal. They had also begun using prophetic language around the crisis. In that context, the word prophetic was not decorative, it was operational. Fabri called Valetti and told her what he had learned. She asked how long they had before the document became public. Fabri answered with the only estimate he could make. If the Munich group had the document and understood it, maybe a week, maybe less. These organizations moved fast when they believed history had handed them a weapon. The danger was not only publication, it was interpretation. A newly discovered medieval manuscript, apparently authentic, containing a passage about a figure after the final pope, tested by fire, would not be presented by Leo's opponents as a scholarly uncertainty. It would be presented as a verdict. In their hands, the passage would not mean that Leo was a shepherd facing a trial. It would mean Leo was the trial. They would argue that the fire, not of his making, was the polite language of institutional destruction that reformers always claim they are saving what they are actually burning. The text did not support that reading cleanly. It did not need to. A frightened audience rarely waits for clean readings. Valetti understood the stakes immediately. They needed someone inside the Vatican who could handle both the scholarship and the political blast radius. Fabri knew she was right. The only question was, Who could be trusted with something old enough to be uncertain and dangerous enough to move quickly? Fabry spent the afternoon of May 27th moving through names in his mind. He needed someone with access, discretion, historical intelligence, and enough political weight to act without turning the discovery into gossip. Most Vatican officials had only part of that combination. Some understood manuscripts, but not power. Others understood power too well and manuscripts too little. By evening, one name remained. Cardinal Gianfranco Rossetti was 58 years old, a diplomat formed by canon law and historical theology with a position in the Secretariat of State that gave him access to the Pope on matters that required judgment before procedure. He was not a public cardinal. He did not cultivate interviews, stage dramatic interventions, or build his influence through visibility. He belonged to the quieter class of Vatican men who become important precisely because they know when not to be seen. Fabry had known Rossetti for 15 years through academic channels. Their conversations had usually been narrow, technical, and buried inside questions of church history that never reached the public. That made the decision easier and more dangerous. If Rossetti dismissed the matter, the warning would die inside bureaucracy. If he understood it, the issue would move upward. That evening, Fabry sent him a short message. It contained no name, no image, and no explicit description of the document. It only signaled that an uncatalogued historical matter had acquired immediate institutional consequences. Rossetti replied, within an hour. The answer was 4 words, tomorrow morning, early. On the morning of May 28th, Fabry met Cardinal Rossetti in a small sitting room in a building adjacent to the Apostolic Palace. There were no staff members present and no recording device visible. Coffee sat untouched on a side table. The room had the controlled stillness of a place used for conversations that later disappeared from paper. Fabry laid out the sequence carefully. He explained the footnote in Paris, the trail through Lyon, the 1923 donation, the uncatalogued subcollection, and the photographs of the vellum document. He described the paleographic evidence, the apparent 12th century consistency, the 112 mods, and the 8-line passage after Petrus Romanus. Then he explained the Munich foundation. Rossetti did not interrupt. He listened with the expression of a man separating fear from information. When Fabry finished, the cardinal asked only 2 questions. Both went directly to the point, where scholarship and crisis met. He asked whether the document's authenticity had been definitively established. Fabry said no, it was consistent with the period in every way he had been able to test. But consistency was not authentication. A rigorous process would take months and require formal resources that had not yet been committed. Rossetti then asked whether the additional passage might have been added later by another hand. Fabry said that was the harder question. The ink and vellum dating covered the document as a whole, but a section-by-section analysis would require direct physical examination and techniques beyond photography. He had not been able to arrange that level of testing. The cardinal sat quietly with the photographs before him. What they had, he said at last, was a document that could be authentic, containing a passage that could be authentic, about to be weaponized by people who were not primarily interested in its scholarly meaning. Fabry answered with one word, yes. Rossetti then spoke about the Pope's position as carefully as a diplomat places a document on a table. The Holy Father was aware of renewed public interest in the Malachy tradition since his election. He had not spoken about it publicly. Privately, Rossetti understood his view to be that prophetic literature of this kind belonged to pious speculation, historically interesting, not doctrinally binding, and not a reliable guide to the future. Fabry said that was a reasonable scholarly position. Rossetti agreed, but added that reasonable scholarly positions do not always survive contact with a well-funded media campaign. He picked up the photographs again and looked at the final line. He read the words softly, almost as if measuring how they would sound in the wrong mouth. He is not the last. He is the test. Rossetti set the photographs down and said he needed to think. He also needed to make one inquiry before saying anything more. Fabry understood what that meant. The matter was going upward. Fabry spent the rest of May 28th waiting for a message that might not come. In the afternoon, he taught a seminar at the Gregorian University and moved through this material with the discipline of habit. His students noticed the distraction because he was not a distracted man. He answered questions, closed his folder, and left the room with the expression of someone listening to another conversation entirely. At 9:30 that evening, his phone showed a message from a number he did not recognize. It contained only 3 words, "The office, tomorrow." There was no signature, no explanation, and no need for either. In that circle of Vatican language, the office meant the Apostolic Palace. On the morning of May 29th, Dr. Aurelio Fabry sat in an anteroom of the Apostolic Palace with an encrypted drive and a printed summary of his findings. The summary was 12 pages long and annotated by hand. He had brought no dramatic evidence, no theatrical folder, and no argument shaped for persuasion. He had brought what a historian brings when history becomes dangerous: documents, limits, and doubt. When he was shown into the room, Cardinal Rossetti was already there. A second, senior official from the Secretariat of State stood nearby. A man Fabry recognized from Vatican functions, but did not know by name. At the desk, working through a stack of briefing papers in a chair that was not particularly grand, sat Pope Leo XIV. The Pope looked up. He was 70 years old, with a calm that seemed earned rather than performed. His face carried the restraint of a man who had been asked hard questions long before the world learned to watch him. When he spoke Fabre's name, his English held the flat vowels of Chicago, softened by decades spent in other languages. He did not try to impress the room. Leo told him to sit down. He did not ask for a presentation. The 12-page summary was already on the table, which meant Rossetti had placed it before him in advance. The Pope looked at the document and asked one question first. In Fabre's professional judgment as a historian, what was this manuscript? Fabre had been preparing for that question since January, but preparation did not make the answer easier. He told the Pope the truth. The document was consistent with a 12th century origin. The passage was consistent with the rest of the document, and the incomplete provenance chain did not contradict what had been found. But consistency was not proof, he continued carefully. It could be an authentic, pre-Juan variant of the Malachy tradition. It could also be an elaborate and highly skilled forgery. The tools available to him so far could not distinguish between those possibilities with certainty. In a room built on hierarchy, Fabre's uncertainty became the only honest form of authority. The Pope asked what Fabre thought it was. That was the harder question, because judgment lives where evidence has not finished speaking. Fabre said that if someone had constructed a forgery to influence contemporary Catholic politics, he would have expected the additional passage to be more explicit and more directly useful. The actual wording was ambiguous in ways a forger seeking maximum impact might not have chosen. Leo listened without movement. Then he asked what the passage meant as a historical statement, apart from its origin. Fabre answered that if read not as supernatural prophecy, but as institutional observation, the idea was not unusual. Institutions face moments when survival depends not on structures, resources, or inherited authority, but on whether they can become what they claim to be. Historians see that pattern everywhere. The Pope repeated the final line from memory. He is not the last. He is the test. The room stayed still after he said it. Then Leo said he had been called worse things. It was not quite a joke. It carried too much history to be cleanly humorous. He turned to the Munich Foundation. Rossetti answered with more current intelligence than Fabre had. The Foundation's representative had confirmed access to the archive, but it was not yet clear whether he had located the specific document. Communications from the previous 48 hours suggested the search was still active. Leo heard that and understood the window immediately. He stood and the meeting began to close around the movement. He ordered the document authenticated through the proper scientific process with a formal request, full resources, and specialists whose integrity could not be questioned. He wanted the results published through standard scholarly channels, not managed for effect, not hidden, and not timed like a political counterattack. Whatever the manuscript was, it would be assessed like any other historical artifact. Fabre warned that the process could take a year or more. Leo said he knew. Then he gave the only instruction that mattered. Do it correctly. As he turned to leave, the Pope stopped without turning back. He said the Malachy tradition, its claims about the final pope and whatever it might suggest about whoever followed, were not his concern. He had no opinion on whether the prophecy was true. His concern was the Church in the present. Then he defined the test in terms manuscript could control. Whatever Malachy had written, or whatever someone else had written in those 8 lines, the response was the same. Do the work, tell the truth, accept the cost. Then Pope Leo XIV left the room and the paper remained on the table. After Leo left, Fabre remained seated for a moment longer than necessary. Cardinal Rossetti gathered the papers from the table with the careful movements of a man already thinking 3 steps ahead. The senior official from the Secretariat of State said nothing. In the quiet after the Pope's departure, the 12-page summary looked smaller than it had before, but more dangerous. Rossetti looked up and told Fabre that Leo had read the full summary the night before. All 12 pages. He had written questions in the margins. Fabre asked, what kind of questions? Rossetti answered that they were historical questions. Malachy's visit to Rome in 1139. Bernard of Clairvaux. Language about prophetic gifts and the political context in which a text like this could have been preserved or invented. Fabre understood then that Leo had not treated the manuscript as an omen. He had treated it as a problem to be understood. That was what made the response so difficult to attack. There was no panic to expose, no superstition to ridicule, and no attempt to bury what might become inconvenient. There was only method, and method was harder to weaponize. Outside, Rome was entering its morning. Traffic thickened along the Vadella Conciliat. Tourists gathered near the edges of St. Peter's Square, and the dome of the basilica caught the early light with its usual indifference to the arguments taking place beneath it. Somewhere in Munich, an organization was preparing its case. Somewhere in Rome, a document waited inside an archive, either 880 years old or a recent fabrication skilled enough to imitate the dead. At Casa Santa Marta, a 70-year-old man from Chicago began another day as the first American pope in the history of the Catholic Church. The day would bring decisions whose consequences he could not fully predict, pressures from directions he could not fully control, and a church described by different voices as either approaching renewal or nearing disaster. The Malachy question had no answer yet. The test did not wait for one. Whether the document was genuine or false, whether its hidden passage came from a medieval hand or a modern deception, whether Leo was the figure described or no living person was, none of it had been resolved. What remained was older than the manuscript and heavier than the prophecy. A man, a task, a church that had survived every prediction of its end, and a world that kept producing exactly the kind of trouble that reveals what leaders are made of. The meaning of those 8 lines would not be decided by an archive, a foundation, a scholar, or even a cardinal with annotated pages on his desk. It would be decided by what happened next inside rooms where decisions were made quietly and consequences arrived without warning. He was not the last. He was the test. And what happened next was still being written.